The day I was discharged from the hospital. After 7 long months, a lifetime spent within those sterile white walls, I finally passed through the hospital's automatic doors. A cool breeze caressed my cheek, and I felt the crisp, dry air fill my lungs, reaching into the deepest corners. The moment I took that first breath of outside air on my own, for some reason, my chest tightened. I can go home. I can finally go home, I whispered to myself. A faint, delicate hope began to blossom inside me. My family would be waiting for me. I would get to see my grandson smile again. That thought alone was what had given me the strength to endure 7 months of excruciating pain. The nurse pushing my walker said, "You've worked so hard, Evelyn. It's been a long road." Her voice was a gentle echo in the quiet afternoon. I managed a smile in return, surrendering to the feeling of pure happiness that was welling up from deep within my heart. But I had no way of knowing then. No way of knowing that what lay ahead of me was not a homecoming, but a living nightmare. The taxi pulled up silently in front of my house. The familiar front door, the same old doorbell. And yet, the entire scene felt somehow distant and achingly cold. I gently pulled my small suitcase behind me and pressed the bell next to the door. Ding dong. But the moment I heard the chime, before my heart even had a chance to beat faster with anticipation, an icy dread shot through me. For some reason, a tiny flicker of anxiety ignited in the pit of my stomach. After a long moment, the door opened slowly. Standing there was my daughter-in-law, Susan. There was no smile on her face, just a silent, blank expression as she looked down at me. "You're home." Her words were flat, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. Her voice was as brittle as dry paper, and it sliced right through me. "I called you yesterday, and the day before, I let you know I was coming home." I started to say, but the words caught in my throat. The emails I'd sent, the phone messages I'd left, had they all vanished into thin air? Or had they simply been ignored? I couldn't be sure. "Oh, you did? I must have missed them," she said without a hint of apology. I just gave a small nod and stepped across the threshold. My feet felt heavy as I walked deeper into the house, as if I were a trespasser in a stranger's home. The air inside was completely different from the warmth I remembered. The furniture had been rearranged in subtle ways, and the dim, shadowy lighting made me feel like an unwelcome ghost, a useless silhouette floating in their space. "Jason has tutoring today. He'll be late," Susan said. She spoke my grandson's name, but there was no trace of affection or joy in her voice. With that, my daughter-in-law turned and walked into the kitchen. Her back seemed as cold and impenetrable as a brick wall. I swallowed the unspoken words, the formless lump of emotion in my chest, and made my way into the living room. On the wall, a large poster shouted, "Acceptance to your dream school." My old bookshelf, the one filled with my nursing textbooks and novels, was gone. The entire area had been transformed into their space, a space for my son's family. The sofa was piled high with unfamiliar cushions and magazines I'd never seen before. This used to be my room." I lost my voice, standing there in stunned silence. I dragged the suitcase I'd brought with me from the front hall and opened the door to what had once been my own bedroom. The words that escaped my lips were swallowed by the empty air. It wasn't my bedroom anymore. It was a student's desk, textbooks, a bright study lamp, another dream school. Poster taped to the wall, it had been literally repurposed, turned into my grandson's study. "I made this room Jason's study space, Mother Miller. He needs it for his college entrance exams." Susan's voice drifted down the hallway. I couldn't say a thing. I found a tiny, empty corner of the room to set my suitcase down and managed to reply, "I see." Perhaps, in this house, I was no longer a mother or a mother-in-law. I was just an obstacle. That night, I found a white envelope lying on the dining room table. A single sentence was scrawled on it in my son's handwriting. "Important documents. Please read carefully." I didn't have the courage to check the contents right away, but I knew I couldn't just leave it there. My hand trembled as I tore it open. Inside were property deeds. My eyes scanned the pages, searching for the ownership section. When I found it, I saw a name etched in black ink. It was not my own. Owner, Michael Miller, my son's name. The ownership had been transferred 1 month after I was hospitalized, during a time when I hadn't even regained full consciousness. Beneath that was a gift deed. The date was April 10th, 2023. The very day I had been lying helpless in the intensive care unit. My hands started to shake violently. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, unable to support my own weight. There was no welcome home here. No, we missed you. Just a cold, silent back turned against me, and a stack of heartless papers. Clutching the envelope to my chest, I stared up at the ceiling, and tears began to well in my eyes, blurring the sterile white paint above. But deep within those tear-filled eyes, a light had not yet been extinguished. The flicker of the person I once was, the woman who had loved and been loved, who had protected others. That night, I stood alone in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. What looked back was a face etched with deep wrinkles, hair streaked with white. Even if this house, this family, has cast me aside, this light. My name is Evelyn Miller. Welcome home, Evelyn Miller. It's good to have you back, I whispered to my own reflection. I was born in 1951, in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia called Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I am now 72 years old. I chose to pursue nursing from a young age. After graduating from nursing school, I began my career at our local community hospital. Even after I married, I continued to work. While raising 2 sons, I spent 38 years as a head nurse on my ward, caring for more patients than I could ever count. My husband was a good, honest man who worked for the city, but he passed away suddenly from a heart attack when he was 60. After he was gone, my eldest son, Michael, and his wife suggested I move in with them, into the large house we now share. For my entire life, I had always been the one supporting others, the one propping up lives. But as the years passed, without me even realizing it, my own place in the world had begun to disappear. From the moment I first stepped into a hospital as a young woman, my mission was clear: to ease the pain of my patients, to support their hope for life. I was only 20 years old when I started my career as a nurse. For 38 years after that, I worked without rest, pouring my entire heart into my profession. That job, the one I had dedicated so much passion to, was my pride and my very reason for living. But then, when I was 60, I lost my beloved husband. When the man I had spent a lifetime with was gone, my entire world turned upside down. After the funeral, when I returned to our empty house, a hollow void tightened around my chest. For so long it had been him and me, a life we supported together. Who would I share my breath with now? Overwhelmed by a profound grief and a crushing loneliness, I walked around in a daze for a long time. I'll never forget the morning after he passed away. The day after the viewing, I stood alone in my kitchen and, without thinking, I automatically started brewing 2 cups of coffee. One regular, with a little cream and sugar, and one black. My husband always loved the robust aroma of a dark roast coffee first thing in the morning. As the steam rose from the mugs, it hit me. Oh, there's no one here to drink this anymore. Feeling my knees about to give out, I quietly carried one of the mugs to the sink and poured the dark liquid down the drain. As I sat down in front of the remaining cup, I finally, truly accepted the reality of my new life. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be completely alone. Just before he passed, lying in his hospital bed, he squeezed my hand tightly and said to me, "You have to live longer than me, Evelyn. Promise me you'll live enough for the both of us." His eyes, though brimming with unshed tears, held a look of peace. I tried to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, what are you talking about?" But a warmth spread through my chest, and all I could do was nod. Even now, on the days when I feel like I might be crushed by the loneliness, his words give me the strength to wake up in the morning. For the both of us, I tell myself. I feel that his words are still pushing me forward, even today. It was during that difficult time that my son Michael and his wife approached me. "You can't possibly live here all by yourself anymore, Mom," they said. In my line of work, I had seen countless families struggle with caregiving. The last thing I wanted was to become a burden myself, and I felt a deep-seated fear of being seen as someone who needed to be taken care of. So, though I answered them with a hesitant, "Thank you, that's very kind of you," my heart was filled with a swirl of complicated emotions. Our old house in Cherry Hill wasn't just a building. It was a repository of over 30 years of our life together, with every memory etched into its walls. In the corner of our backyard stood an old apple tree my husband had planted when he was a young man. Every autumn, it would produce a crop of slightly misshapen, but wonderfully sweet apples, and my husband's greatest joy was sharing them with our neighbors. "The apples aren't too tart this year," he'd say with a laugh, his pruning shears in hand as he climbed a small ladder to reach the higher branches. The image of him there, framed against the blue sky, is burned into my memory. And then there was the kitchen, that was my domain, my command center. In that small kitchen, for 30 years, I made lunches every single morning for my children before they went to school, the sizzle of eggs in the frying pan, the gentle hum of the fan cooling the rice for my husband's lunchbox, his voice behind me, peeking over my shoulder and asking, "What's on the menu today?" On? That small space was alive with the rhythms of our family. But after my husband was gone and the children had grown and moved out, the house slowly filled with a deepening silence. Amid that quiet, the decision to sell this house and move was a choice I made, to protect my own heart and body from further strain. But on the day I had to sign the closing papers, my hand trembled. "I'm not just letting go of a house," I thought. "I'm saying goodbye to my past self." The moment that thought crossed my mind, my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The stamp of the notary on that single document wasn't just about moving, it was the final, definitive end of an entire chapter of my life. Still, my physical strength and my emotional energy were fading. I knew I couldn't keep living alone. I had to make a decision. I chose convenience and security. I moved forward with the sale, and I put every single penny of the proceeds toward the purchase of the new, two-story house where I live now. I gave up the home in New Jersey where I had built a life with my husband and moved closer to my son and his family. I paid for the new house entirely with my own funds, and initially, the deed and all the legal paperwork were in my name. However, a short time after we moved in, Michael and Susan came to me. "Mom, we were thinking," Michael started, "it might cause some procedural issues down the line. It would just be better to put the house in my name for now. It'll make things much more convenient if anything ever happens in the future." They handed me a stack of papers for a title transfer. I trusted them completely. I believed this was just a practical measure to make our lives as a family run more smoothly, so I agreed to their request. And so it was that the house I was living in, the house I had paid for and whose bills I primarily covered, was legally transferred into my son's name. I told myself it was fine, that it was a measure to strengthen our family bond, and a decision I had made of my own free will. It was a simple consent, wrapped in the comforting language of family helping family. But somewhere, deep in my heart, a small, nagging voice of anxiety remained. "Are you sure this is okay, Evelyn?" It would whisper. For the next few years, I worked 3 days a week as a consultant at a nearby clinic, specializing in geriatric medicine. I made home visits, helped families create care plans, and spent my days connecting with elderly patients. Every time one of them said, "Thank you, Evelyn," I felt a renewed sense of my purpose and pride as a nurse. But at night, when I came home, the conversations with my family were limited to the bare minimum: the warm, lively family dinners, the feeling of being truly at ease in my own home. All of that felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. One winter evening, I was standing on the back porch with a warm mug of tea, my breath misting in the cold air as I looked up at the stars. For a moment, I sensed a small presence behind me, and I imagined it was Jason. A gentle warmth spread through my chest as I recalled the sound of his young voice. But I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I just smiled into the steam rising from my cup. It was a fleeting warmth, but it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness inside me. After coming home from work, I would often find myself sitting in a corner of the living room, blankly watching whatever pre-recorded show was playing on the television. Sometimes, the programs would trigger memories of laughing with my former patients, and a familiar ache would tighten in my chest. On the one hand, I wanted to believe I was an indispensable part of the family, that my husband, my son, and my grandson would be lost without me. But on the other hand, surrounded as I was by the language of my profession words like caregiving and end of life, I couldn't help but start picturing myself as the one receiving care. My self-esteem was slowly eroding. It felt as though my true place was shifting from my home to my workplace, and I didn't know how to stop the unsettling feeling that was rising from the depths of my heart. Before I was hospitalized, my greatest joy was calling out, "Have a good day at school, Jason," as he left in the morning and seeing his face when he came home in the afternoon, asking him all about his day. That simple ritual was enough. It meant that no matter how exhausted I was at night, I could find a reason to smile again. But over time, the days we all ate dinner together grew fewer and fewer. Gradually, my voice stopped echoing through the living room in the afternoons. Still, I pushed myself to keep going. I told myself that if my contributions led to my family's security and happiness, even if the house wasn't in my name, then it was all worth it. I kept working, clinging to the belief that my place in this family is protected only as long as I continue to support them. In my years as a nurse, I had counseled families dealing with gravely ill loved ones, often swallowing my own tears to remain strong for them. It was my duty to offer healing, and my pride demanded that I never show my own suffering in front of others. That pride had sustained me even after my husband's death, pulling me back from the brink of despair. And so, my past was painted with words like dedication, nursing, and sacrifice. But in the shadows of that life, an unforgettable pain and a quiet suspicion had been slowly, silently taking root. The night before I was admitted to the hospital, sitting alone in the silence of my room, a thought suddenly crossed my mind. Is this life really the right one for me? That question, looking back on it now, was nothing more than a premonition. But to me on that night, it was just a simple, innocent prayer, a belief that a peaceful tomorrow and time spent with my family were still things I could hold in my hands, things I had a right to expect. Yes, a right. No, a will. And that will has not been extinguished yet. On that first night home from the hospital, I took a deep breath, clutched the crumpled envelope to my chest, and made a vow. This is not over yet. My relationship with my son, Michael, used to be so wonderfully peaceful and warm. I can still hear his voice saying, "Welcome home, Mom," when I'd get back from a long shift at the hospital. He had a rebellious phase as a teenager, of course, but deep down, he was always a kind boy who cared deeply for his family. I'll never forget the day of his wedding. The night before, I noticed a small, loose thread on the hem of his bride's gown. I secretly stitched it back into place myself. Everything has to be perfect for their new beginning. I remember thinking as I carefully moved the needle and thread. On the day of the ceremony, I pulled him aside and whispered, "You know, Michael, being a husband isn't just about protecting someone. It's not enough. You have to really listen. Listen to her heart." He looked a little embarrassed but smiled and nodded. "I know, Mom." Seeing that smile, I finally felt it. My job of raising him is done. But where did that understanding son go? Where did that "I know" disappear to? As the years went by, Michael spoke to me less and less. I'm sure part of it was because he was busy with work. But that gentle, peaceful smile he used to have had vanished from our daily lives. On my 70th birthday, I ate breakfast alone. No one said happy birthday. All I got was a single text message on my phone. "Happy birthday, Mom. Take care of yourself." I read those few words and managed a small smile as I sipped my tea. But that smile was a little bitter, like lukewarm tea that had been left out too long. I was learning, day by day, just how lonely it is to live under the same roof with people whose hearts you can no longer reach. One evening at the dinner table, an assortment of store-bought side dishes was laid out, and each of us was already eating from our own plates. My daughter-in-law Susan was scrolling through her phone, moving her fork to her mouth in silence. My son was staring down at a news app, eating mechanically. No one was speaking. Not a single word was exchanged. I silently took a bite of cold, leftover creamed spinach. It tasted like nothing, like eating air. You know, I said, trying to break the silence. I was thinking of making that pot roast you all used to love this weekend. It was my signature dish, something our family used to enjoy together all the time. Without even looking up from her phone, Susan replied, "Oh, pot roast? I don't know. I'm not really in the mood for something that heavy, and the smell lingers for days. But you can make it for yourself if you want." Her words weren't sharp or intentionally cruel. They were just indifferent, and that utter lack of interest was what felt colder than anything. I just said, "Oh, I see," and put my fork down. There were 3 people sitting at that table. But in that moment, I felt completely and utterly invisible. Last year, that was when the event that would completely upend my life began. One morning, I woke up to find that I couldn't move the right side of my body, and the words I tried to speak came out garbled, swallowed before they could form. From that moment, I was thrust into a world of emergency transport, of staring up at the white ceilings of a hospital, living in the narrow space between life and death, after a massive stroke. The 7 months that followed, even after I regained consciousness, were an endless cycle of physical therapy, speech therapy, and relearning how to walk. Day after day, strapped to machines, covered in sweat and fighting through the pain, I took one small step at a time. I pushed down the pain, held back the tears, and focused on a single goal: to go home. But during that entire time in the hospital, my family, especially my daughter-in-law, never once came to visit me. My only contact with them came in bits and pieces, relayed through the nurses. "Your family called to see how you are. They say they're thinking of you and hoping you feel better soon." Every time I heard those secondhand words, my heart ached. I just wanted to see my children, to see my grandson's face, just once. Then one day, a young nurse came and sat quietly by my bedside. "Grandma," she whispered, leaning in close, "please be careful when you go home. I happened to overhear something. I think there might have been some kind of change to the paperwork for your house." At that moment, I instinctively furrowed my brow. Something stirred uneasily in the pit of my stomach. A cold wind seemed to blow through my heart. "I'm not sure exactly what it means," she continued, her voice low but her gaze serious. "But if you have any idea what I might be talking about, you might want to look into it." It was a strange moment, a collision of my anxiety about my family and my desperate desire to believe in them. For a split second, my mind flashed back to the day I signed the papers to transfer the title. It had been over 10 years ago, but I wondered, where were those documents now? Despite my inner turmoil, I forced a smile for the young nurse. "Thank you for your concern, dear. But I'm sure it's nothing. Once I'm discharged, I can just clear it up with my family." But inside, I was whispering, "Can I, really?" I didn't have the energy or the clarity of mind to press her for more details. As my discharge date approached, I held on to my goal and poured every last bit of my strength into my final rehabilitation sessions. I had clawed my way back from the brink of death, and all I could think about was going home. But at the same time, that young nurse's words echoed in my mind every night, squeezing my chest with a cold fear. A change to the paperwork. It was a terrifying premonition, a feeling that, without my knowledge, my own home was slowly dissolving, melting away from me. My hospital room was filled with noise, the doctors discussing my chronic conditions, the groaning of the equipment in the physical therapy room, and the frantic, pounding beat of my own heart, which seemed to dominate everything. But who could I confide in? Who could I tell about this growing fear? Even as my discharge date grew closer, my daughter-in-law remained a distant, unreachable figure. All official information from the hospital was sent to her via email. I had a few photos and my old day planner with me in my room, but every time I looked at them, my heart would flutter with anxiety. A knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Visiting hours were already restricted, and even the well wishes of my nieces and nephews couldn't get through. Slowly but surely, the nurse's warning began to feel less like a possibility, and more like an impending reality, engraving itself onto my heart. Late one night, I reached out to feel the warmth of my pillow, and I whispered into the darkness of the room, "Is this house? Is it still truly mine?" In the final days of my hospital stay, as I finished my last physical therapy session and chewed my bland hospital food, the feeling in my chest was no longer a desire to go home. It had been replaced by a much larger, much darker fear. What is going to happen to me when I get there? But there was no one who could answer that question for me. There was no one to answer, and only the fluorescent light in the hospital room flickered quietly, blinking on and off in the silence. Will my family, will they even be happy to have me back? Into the cracks of the fatigue that had settled deep into my body and soul. Over 7 long months, those words from the nurse resurfaced, now heavy with meaning. I think there might have been some kind of change to the paperwork. In the quiet of my room, I clenched my fists. No, it'll be fine. It has to be. My children, they wouldn't abandon me like that. I whispered the words to myself, trying to convince my own heart, and closed my eyes again and again. And so, with a tiny, fragile hope nestled in my chest, I finally drifted off to sleep, waiting for the morning I would be discharged. The day of my discharge, I had no way of knowing at the time that this very moment would be the trigger that would turn all my anxieties into a crushing reality. But the unease coiling in the pit of my stomach did not loosen its grip, not even for a second. The day of my discharge arrived. The morning I was to leave the hospital. The light filtering into my room felt strangely bright, and at the same time, piercingly cold. "Well, this is it. Time to say goodbye to this place," a nurse said, her voice gentle as she helped me with my last few things. I quietly pulled out my smartphone. With a trembling hand, I opened the rideshare app. As I navigated the screen with my fingertip, a thought ran through my mind. They must all be so busy. The most important thing is that I'm getting out of here, healthy and on my own 2 feet. There's no need to call someone and put them out, is there? The moment the notification, "Your driver will arrive shortly," appeared on the screen, the nurse who had been standing beside me suddenly asked, "Your family? They aren't coming today?" For a second, I was at a loss for words, but I quickly forced a smile onto my face and replied, "Oh no, my children, you see. They trust that I'm strong enough to handle it on my own." So, even as I said it, I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but in that moment, it was the only form of strength I could manage to display. I had arranged for the car myself, and once inside, I found myself staring blankly out the window. Alongside the anticipation of going home, there was a persistent, nagging feeling of unease, as if I had forgotten something vital. The scenery scrolling past the window was familiar, the streets of the town I knew so well, but all I felt was a strange and hollow emptiness spreading through my chest. When the car pulled up in front of the house, I gently pulled my suitcase behind me and walked toward the front door on my own 2 feet. The moment my hand reached for the keyhole, my fingertips began to tremble. My home, for the first time in 7 months. But what was this terrible feeling of dread? My breathing quickened just a little, and I could feel a thin film of sweat forming on my palms. The car came to a slow, quiet stop in front of my house. I thanked the driver and carefully stepped out onto the curb. As I gripped the handle of my suitcase, I realized a cold sweat had already beaded on my hand. I stood before the front door and pressed the doorbell. Ding dong! But there was no response. I waited for several minutes, but I couldn't hear a single footstep from inside. I pressed the button again with the tip of my finger. Ding dong. This time, a gust of wind blew past, whipping the hem of my coat and soaking the cuffs of my pants with a fine, cold mist. As the chill began to seep into my bones, I finally gave up and sat down on top of my suitcase. It must have been 10 minutes by now, I murmured to myself, while anxiety and loneliness bloomed like a dark flower in my chest. Someone had to be home. I was sure of it, and yet the door remained shut. The sound of the doorbell just echoed emptily in the cold air. Nue S, Nue P, Nue Surd. When they open it, they'll surely be smiling, and they'll say, "Welcome home. You must be so tired. It's been so hard," they'll say, and they'll pull me into a hug. Clinging to that small, simple hope, I kept repeating to myself, over and over, "It'll be fine." Finally, the front door creaked open. It was my daughter-in-law, Susan, who emerged. But what I found there was not the warmth I had imagined, but a wall of cold air and an expressionless gaze. She glanced at me and then spoke. "Well, oh, Mother Miller, you came home by yourself? You didn't tell us you were coming, you startled me." In that instant, my chest tightened as if squeezed by an invisible hand. I had called them so many times. The hospital must have sent notifications as well, but faced with her words, with her attitude, all I could do was offer a weak smile. "Yes, I'm so sorry. The discharge was decided rather suddenly. The voice that escaped my lips was so frail it felt as though the wind might carry it away." When I realized that not a single word of heartfelt welcome would be offered. For my return, it took every ounce of my strength just to draw a deep breath. That was all I could manage to say. The rest of the words were caught in my throat. Not even a simple, "You must be tired." No one said it. My daughter-in-law remained silent, taking a single step to the side to let me inside. As I passed through the entryway, I saw that the furniture had been rearranged, and the air in the living room felt distant, unwelcoming. I remembered a time when I would look upon even the smallest wildflower on the side of the road with affection, and the stark difference between that memory and this reality left me stunned. Perhaps my place was no longer here. Dragging my suitcase behind me, I made my way down the hall. I tried to steady my breathing, but my legs were still trembling. When I reached the door to what was once my room, I paused. My hand was shaking so much I couldn't get a firm grip on the doorknob. "This is your room, Evelyn," my daughter-in-law stated flatly. The moment she finished speaking, she pushed the door open with her shoulder. Inside, there was a small student desk, a child-sized chair sitting in the middle of the room, and on the walls, SAT prep worksheets and motivational posters had been tacked up with a cold, impersonal precision. When I stepped inside, it was clear that this was no longer the space that had, once been my bedroom. Not in any sense of the word. "We made your old room into a study space for Jason, Mother Miller," Susan said. Her back still turned to me. There was no consideration in her voice, no sympathy, as if this were the most natural and obvious change in the world. The room that had once been my place had already been transformed into a space for someone else, and a deep chill settled in my heart. I left my suitcase standing against the wall and stared silently at the desk. I had supported this family. I had poured irreplaceable memories into this home. But what stood here now was not a place for me. And then, with a surprising quietness, I whispered the thought in my mind. Where am I supposed to go? In front of the desk was a small chair, one that a grandmother could hardly sit in comfortably. The closet doors were shut, and I could tell it had been turned into a storage space for their things. By the window, the potted plants I had once carefully tended were gone, with not even a trace of them left behind. Is it possible that I have no place to return to anymore? Anywhere at all? With a feeling like a vice tightening around my chest, I narrowed my eyes slightly. I couldn't forget the sensation of sweat trickling down my forehead, each drop feeling as if it were stripping away another piece of my dignity. Behind me, my daughter-in-law made a sound like a sigh and, without turning around, said, "We've prepared a futon for you in the living room, so feel free." In that moment, I literally couldn't breathe. When I saw the bedding already laid out in the living room, I knew with absolute certainty this was no longer my home. Perhaps there wouldn't even be a "thank you." Swallowing the sob that was rising in my throat, I gave a small nod. "I understand." That single phrase tasted like dry sand in my mouth, and the moment it left my lips, it seemed to catch in the back of my throat. I moved toward the futon in the living room and, with my back still turned to her, I took a deep, shuddering breath. My coat was still slightly damp at my feet, and the wheels of my suitcase were caked with a thin layer of mud from the afternoon. That night, I sat quietly on the futon that had been laid out in a corner of the living room. The air in the room was cold, and its location, right next to the front door, made it feel like a temporary makeshift bed. On the other side of a thin wall, the kitchen light was on. No one was in there. Yet for some reason, it had been left on, casting a harsh, bright glare. I pulled the blanket closer and listened intently. From upstairs, I could faintly hear the sound of laughter. Was it the television? Or was it my family enjoying their time together? But whichever it was, my name was not being called. There was a time when we would all gather around the television after dinner, laughing at stories about my grandson. Night, I was not there. I curled up quietly under the covers and stared at the ceiling. Directly above me was a water stain on the white plaster and the shade of right old fluorescent light fixture. It felt as if it were telling me, "This is your place now." And then, I whispered to myself, did I really make it home? The words weren't directed at anyone. They were like a single drop of rain falling into the depths of my heart, soaking into my very being. When I closed my eyes, the memories of the day came flooding back. The cold wind at the front door, the damp hem of my coat, and the heavy weight of that door as it finally opened, all pressing down on my chest once more. Tonight, my sleep would surely not be deep. And yet, I wanted so desperately to believe that I was still a member of this family, so I quietly closed my eyes. As I clasped my hands together under the blanket, I gently told myself, even as night fell and darkness enveloped the house, the light from the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling offered no warmth, serving only to illuminate my solitary existence. It's okay, I hope tomorrow is a little warmer. I reached for the envelope that had been placed by my pillow and, with trembling fingers, I gently picked it up. This moment of homecoming was the first step, the point at which all my anxieties had finally taken shape and begun to shatter my world. But I still had no idea of the true extent of it. I didn't yet have the courage to open it, so I simply faced the hollow night, a place where the reality before me and my own memories swirled together in a painful blur. That night, the white envelope lying in the corner of the living room seemed to call to me silently, like a trap. Curled up under a thin blanket, I reached for it with a trembling hand. On the front, in what looked like my son's handwriting, were the words, "Important notice." My heart began to pound, and I felt a sheen of sweat on my forehead as I carefully broke the seal with my fingertips. Inside were two documents. The first was a notice of ownership transfer from Evelyn Miller to Michael Miller. My entire body went rigid just seeing my son's name. The other was a contract from a financial institution. On it were words indicating a new lien. This property to be used as collateral for a loan from First National Bank for the purpose of cryptocurrency trading funds. Cryptocurrency, business, I gasped. I looked at the date, May 8, 2023. To my horror, that was during the time I was lying in the intensive care unit, barely conscious. On that day, I vaguely remembered a doctor trying to rouse me, but I couldn't speak properly, my memory a complete haze. How could a contract like this be in my name? How could my signature be on a document like this? My mind went completely blank, and the edges of my vision began to swim. But I desperately tried to tell myself, I have to stay calm. Pressing a hand to my chest to still my racing heart, I gently placed the documents on the floor and stood up. Looking down at the envelope on the futon, I whispered quietly, "But what in the world is going on?" The next morning, I made my way upstairs with heavy steps. With each stair I climbed, my heart hammered painfully in my chest, and I felt the strength draining from my body. When I stepped into the second-floor office, I saw a set of documents, identical to the ones from the envelope last night, lying carelessly on the desk. My daughter-in-law, scrolling on her smartphone from the sofa, said, "Oh, those papers? They came from the bank. Did you read them?" Her voice was utterly detached, as if she were talking about a piece of junk mail. With a shaking hand, I picked up the documents and looked at her. This looks like a notice of a title transfer. And a new lien agreement? It has my signature on it. The words got stuck in my throat, and a sob threatened to escape from deep within me. But my daughter-in-law didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Yes, that's right. The contract is signed and sealed. I'm sure my son and the bank have confirmed everything. All the procedures are complete, so you don't have to worry, I guess?" A faint trace of sarcasm seemed to color the edge of her words. I took a deep breath, placed both hands on the desk, and looked down. But this date? This was when I was unconscious. How could you process something like this then? I asked, my voice trembling. Susan looked slightly annoyed as she glanced up from her phone and answered, "It was that day, yes, but I heard that Michael handled the paperwork using the power of attorney he had. He needed the house as collateral for a loan he took out from the bank for his cryptocurrency investments. Investments in cryptocurrency." The word alone made every cell in my body freeze. My knees gave out from under me, and I collapsed to the floor. The hand clutching the papers began to shake uncontrollably. My house. And without my knowledge, a wave of helplessness and the bitter sorrow of betrayal pierced my heart, and tears began to stream down my cheeks. I leaned back against the wall, still crumpled on the floor, trying to stifle my sobs. The second document in the envelope was a new loan agreement with the financial institution. As I scanned the page again, all the remaining strength left my body. Collateral property, Lot 208. That description was, without a doubt, referring to the two-story house I had poured my entire life savings into. My chest tightened with a fresh wave of tears. As I read on, a horrifying line of text jumped out at me. Loan amount, redacted, annual interest rate, 9.80%, term, 10 years. A high-interest loan at 9.8% annually, with a repayment period of 10 years under any normal circumstances. No sane person, unless they were suffering from dementia, would ever agree to such a contract. In my hazy state of consciousness, I couldn't possibly have understood what it meant. And yet, there it was, my seal, and in the space for my approval, a clear signature. While I was unconscious, someone had used my home as collateral to take out a loan. This can't be. This can't be happening. Clutching the papers, I stared down at them through the gaps between my fingers. The numbers and letters printed there looked like evidence of a deliberate plot to destroy my life. A soundless cry escaped my lips, and I leaned against the desk for support. No matter what the circumstances were, for them to use an elderly mother's assets as collateral like this, without her comprehension, it was unthinkable. A quiet rage began to smolder deep in my chest. They had truly stolen my house, and then borrowed money against it for cryptocurrency investments. In the midst of my confusion and betrayal, I felt for a moment as if my own heartbeat had stopped. The house wasn't lent, no, it wasn't given, it was stolen. A tear dripped onto the paper, blurring the ink. The stain it left behind seemed to symbolize my powerlessness, a sacrifice that no one had ever wanted. Just then, the visiting nurse from the hospital arrived for a follow-up. The moment she saw me, she understood something was wrong and rushed to my side. "Evelyn, are you all right? Is there anything I can do to help?" I looked up, clutching the documents to my chest as if to show her. "What is this? What am I supposed to do?" The nurse knelt down beside me comfortingly and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know the specifics, but this seems legally very problematic. I think you need to confront your family and get some clear answers." Her advice resonated deep within me, and something inside me snapped. The quiet rage and the long-suppressed grief threatened to boil over at once. This could be fraud, couldn't it? Yes. These procedures were carried out while you were unconscious. You weren't able to review the documents, and you had no knowledge of their contents. It's highly unlikely that proper consent was given, the nurse said, nodding gravely. My voice shook as I asked the question, and the nurse's firm agreement solidified my resolve. I let out a long, shuddering breath. Amid the pain that felt like it was tearing my chest apart, I was finally beginning to reclaim my own will. I understand, thank you. As soon as I can, I'm going to consult with a legal expert. The nurse nodded gently and placed the documents softly in front of me. I gathered them into my arms and, still sitting on the floor, I made a vow. I will not let this go. The memory from that day was hazy, like a thick fog I couldn't quite grasp. But there was one thing, one sensation I could never forget. As I lay there, my consciousness wavering, I had vaguely thought, oh, is the nurse checking my pulse? It was the feeling of something soft and tacky being pressed against my fingertip. I couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes, and I simply accepted the sensation. But now, staring at the documents from the envelope, I felt a shock so profound, it was as if all the blood in my body was flowing in reverse. Could it be that, at that moment, this was, instead of a signature, they used my finger? My chest grew so tight it was hard to breathe, and I instinctively looked down at my own right hand. I had the strangest feeling that a faint, inky stain remained on this old, wrinkled finger of mine. I was used without even knowing it. The moment the thought formed, my breathing hitched and tears threatened to spill over. What I had assumed was a routine part of my medical care might have been the creation of evidence to steal my property. I slowly brought my fingertips to my chest, holding them tight, and whispered in a trembling voice, I'm so sorry, Frank. I couldn't protect it. My suspicion of my family had turned to despair, and that despair was now hardening into a firm resolve to act. My place to come home to had been stolen and then used as collateral for a loan. I would never, ever forget the depth of this betrayal. And so, quietly, but with absolute certainty, the flame of my counterattack was lit. The next morning, I found myself staring at my right hand. Something at the edge of my vision had caught my eye, a detail that felt unnatural, out of place. At the base of my thumbnail, a faint, bluish-black color, like an ink stain, still remained. It was like a trace of the past that time had not yet managed to erase. I couldn't help but stare at my own fingertip. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a cold sweat prickle on my back as I was forced to ask myself the question again. Is it possible that, at that moment, they used this finger to make a mark? That day, in my hospital bed, I couldn't move of my own volition. The only thing that remained sharp in my memory was that sensation of something soft being pressed against my fingertip. I had thought it was just a nurse's hand, but now, was I used unconsciously? I whispered aloud. The moment I said it, the strength drained from my hands, and I nearly collapsed where I stood. To be betrayed by those you trust is not just sad, it's a pain that feels as if it's shaving away at your very soul. And that pain had a depth that could not be washed away by simple anger or tears. The sound of the television, the voices of my family, they all sounded distant, as if I were the only person in this house, completely cut off and isolated in the silence. That night, with the documents laid out before me, I sat alone in a dimly lit corner of the living room. Just then, I suddenly heard my husband's voice, as clear as if he were whispering in my ear. It was what he had said on one of his last nights in the hospital. His strength was already fading, but he gripped my hand and whispered the words to me. If you end up living longer than me, Evelyn, I want you to live enough for the both of us. But, please, promise me this. Don't you dare spend the rest of your life just silently enduring everything. In that instant, something hot and explosive welled up from deep within my chest. At the time, all I could do was cry and nod, unable to say a word in return. But now, Frank, my love, I have been silently enduring. I tried to live. Enough for the both of us, but I've reached my limit. As I spoke the words aloud, I felt something inside me finally snap. I was not just a mother, not just a grandmother. I was the woman who had built this house, who had supported this family, and that was a part of me they could never take away. But before I am a mother, I am a human being. Silence is not a virtue. Not always. I no longer believe that silence is a form of love. I will raise my voice for the meaning of lives that you entrusted to me. This time, I did not hide the tears that welled in my eyes. They were not a sign of weakness. They were the first step in what would become my own battle. A few days after that night, I quietly resolved to stand up. Not to go on living as a wounded victim, but to reclaim this house and my dignity. With a trembling finger, I tapped a number into my smartphone. "Hello, this is Evelyn Miller. I was hoping I could discuss something with you," I said, my voice shaking but my words steady as I explained my situation. He grasped the situation immediately. "Mrs. Miller, I'd like to meet with you to hear the details in person," he said, and I quickly arranged to meet him in the lobby of the hospital I had just been discharged from. The first person I called was a lawyer, an old friend I had trusted for many years. His eyes were serious as he spread the documents out and listened to my story. The title transfer notice, the mortgage agreement, the unnatural dates and the questionable signatures, the fact that all the procedures had been carried out while I was unconscious, and finally, the existence of the conditional deed of gift I had drawn up. Years ago, while I was still in good health, I never dreamed that that one piece of paper would now be my shield. The deed stated in clear terms, "The grantor, Evelyn Miller, transfers this property to the grantee, Michael Miller, at no cost, on the condition that a sincere and respectful family relationship is maintained for the duration of the grantor's life. However, should the grantee subject the grantor to unjust treatment, this gift shall be rendered null and void, and full ownership of the property shall revert to the grantor." You see, I had carefully stored the original copy of that conditional deed of gift in a very special place. It was a secret place, a single drawer of memories that no one else in this house knew about. In my old bedroom dresser, in the very back of the bottom drawer, there is a small rosewood box. It was a box my husband Frank used to keep, a treasured place for his handkerchiefs. After Frank passed away, I couldn't bring myself to open it. It felt as if all his kindness, the warmth of his voice, was sealed inside. But one day, a thought struck me. If something were to happen to me, I want to protect the memories of this house. With that thought, I gently placed the original copy of the deed inside that box. No one in my family even knew the box existed. It wasn't locked. It was a place protected not by a key, but by love alone. The paper was slightly faded with age, but the words written on it were my pride, plain and simple. "This is the proof of the life Frank and I built together. I will not let anyone steal it from me." Clutching the deed to my chest, I made a silent, firm vow deep in my heart. With my lawyer friend, I returned home, carrying a copy of the original deed and a signed power of attorney, my face tense with anticipation. And then, one Sunday evening, I called everyone into the living room under the pretense of a family meeting. My daughter-in-law looked up from her smartphone, and my son appeared, pushing a stack of papers aside with his elbow. I spoke to them quietly. "Thank you all for your time. There is a document I need to review with you today." I carefully removed an envelope and presented the copy and the original of the conditional deed of gift. This is a legally binding contract that I had drawn up 5 years ago. I am going to read it aloud. My voice trembled, but I read with a firm and certain will. Article 3. The grantee is obligated to treat the grantor with sincere care and respect in her life. Should the grantee neglect this duty, the gift shall be rendered void, and ownership of the property shall revert to the grantor. A heavy silence filled the living room. When I quietly slid the original document across the table, my son froze, as if he'd been turned to ice. The two people before me, my son and my daughter-in-law, their expressions shifted, their bewilderment obvious. As his eyes traced the words on the page, line by line, the color slowly drained from his face. Then, in a quavering voice, he stammered, How do you have this, Mom? Where was it?" His hands were unconsciously gripping the fabric of his pants. twisting the material on his lap, so tightly, so forcefully, that his knuckles turned white. His eyes were filled with shock and confusion, and what looked like fear. I looked at him, my gaze steady, and answered quietly, "A mother doesn't leave everything to chance, Michael. I was simply prepared, just in case." In that instant, his expression changed to one of dawning realization, the look of someone who understood he was not going to get his way. And in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, you thought I was just some old woman who knew nothing, who had nothing left, who was simply fading away. But before I am a mother, I am a person. I don't remember this, my son muttered. But for you to have the proof, my daughter-in-law began, her voice laced with anxiety. I offered a faint smile and placed the documents on the table. I have kept the original copy of this document safe for a very long time. This is the first time I have ever shown it to either of you. It was clear they had never imagined that I had been silently enduring and preparing for all this time. In that moment, the air in the room felt like it had turned to ice. Therefore, I have every right to take back this house. And I am in a position where I must also seek damages for the emotional distress I have suffered, I stated, my voice resolute. My tone was calm, but the anger and sorrow hidden beneath it were deep and sharp. My son was at a loss for words, and my daughter-in-law lowered her gaze. After a moment of silence, I continued quietly. If you two are willing to deal with me in good faith, then I would like to reclaim my place as a member of this family. This house is my entire life. However, if that is not possible, I am fully prepared to take legal action. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that deed existed. My daughter-in-law, for the first time, met my eyes directly. We are truly sorry. We completely misjudged you. I remembered. The words. The words my husband left me. Don't just endure in silence. Because of those words, I was able to speak up today. I let out a deep breath and held the deed to my chest with a trembling hand. My family's faces were a mixture of regret and relief. I nodded slowly and spoke in a softer tone. What you choose to do from here on is up to you. But as long as this deed remains in effect, I wish to live here quietly as a member of this family. I couldn't hold back my tears any longer, and a small smile touched my lips as my eyes glistened. My son and daughter-in-law bowed their heads deeply and extended their hands as if in a promise. Mom, we're sorry. From now on, please, let us face this together. I took a deep breath and looked slowly at the family sitting before me. Then, pointing to the deed, I said in a gentle but clear voice, This isn't a threat. And I'm not trying to blame you. Mom, I don't want to fight. Honestly, the last thing I want is to go to court. I just want to know. I paused for a moment, looking down. Then, slowly raising my eyes, I continued. Am I still seen as families in this house? No one answered. But that silence was a heavy weight on my heart. Still smiling, I went on. The condition written in this deed, there is only one. To treat with love and respect. That was the only promise required to build this home together. In that moment, I prayed with all my heart that they would believe in the power of my words. That some things in this world cannot be conveyed with anger or with tears, but only by asking a simple question. In the quiet of the room, I gently spoke. If Mom hadn't spoken up like this today, when exactly would I have been able to sit at the same table as everyone else again? That one sentence changed the air in the room. No one tried to answer. It felt as if even the sound of their utensils had ceased. I was still smiling, but I felt a tightness in my chest, as if it were being squeezed. That night, the night I came home from the hospital, I had laid a futon for myself on the living room floor and eaten my dinner alone. No one sat at the table, and only the sound of the television echoed in the empty space. When did the word families become something so distant? My question was not meant to blame anyone. It was simply a plea, a wish that they would finally notice. And in the silence that followed, I came to a certain understanding. Even if there were no answer today, this question would surely remain in the depths of their hearts. The next morning, the light from the window felt brighter than usual. I had not slept. I folded my bedding and walked over to the living room table. Lying there was the copy of the deed I had presented yesterday, along with an envelope from my lawyer. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there was a document titled Certified Notice, Demand for Reversion of Ownership, and Claim for Damages. I, lawyer, had written in detail, stating his intent to swiftly file a declaration of intent for restoration to original state, and to pursue both a civil lawsuit for forgery and criminal charges. My voice trembled as I took a deep breath. That day, my lawyer immediately sent notices to the bank and to my son's employer. I soon received a report that he had also filed a motion with the bank to confirm the invalidity of the lien and collateralization. This should get things moving, he said. A few hours later, I received a call from the bank. We have begun a review to release the collateral and the lien. The loan associated with this account has been temporarily frozen. The power of the contract had stopped everything in its tracks. I felt the force of the law at work, and a sense of relief washed over me. Meanwhile, a letter arrived from my son's employer, a company where he had worked for many years. Following an internal investigation, there is a strong suspicion of fraudulent use of documentation and damage to the company's credibility. He is suspended from work, effective immediately. To think that he, a man who had been in a position of responsibility for over 6 years, would be treated as someone who had disrupted corporate order. I felt a pang of sympathy and heartache. That evening, I spoke with my lawyer again on the phone. Don't worry, Evelyn. The bank and his company are both taking action. We have a very strong chance of winning in mediation or in court. Hearing those words, the anger and sorrow I had been suppressing slowly began to transform into a calm sense of hope. But our family relationship could no longer go back to the way it was. I made a decision to avoid the continued pain of staying in that house. That morning, I walked alone, slowly, down the hallway. The sound of my slippers seemed to echo loudly. The familiar walls, the well-known furniture, the houseplants I had tended to with care, all of it seemed to be holding me back, and at the same time, casting me out. I paused at the front door, took a small breath, and whispered quietly, "In this house, they forgot I was a mother. So, I have chosen to leave as a person. For me, a woman who had carried the role of mother for so long, these were not light words, but still, I had no regrets about choosing a path where I could stand on my own 2 feet, as a woman with dignity, not as a mother who was convenient for her family. The moment I placed the key in the mailbox and quietly closed the door, the loneliness in my heart transformed into a quiet pride. I resolved to start a new life, not by depending on my family, but by using my own savings and the settlement I was likely to receive from the lawsuit. The following week, I moved into a high-quality assisted living facility. The night before I left, I packed my things alone. It was a time not so much for thinking about what to take, but what to leave behind. I opened a dresser drawer. Inside were old, worn handkerchiefs, a doodle my son had drawn as a small child, a souvenir from a trip with my husband. They were all small fragments, filled with memories. I picked them up one by one, whispering, "Thank you," in my heart, and gently placed them back where they were. They were too heavy to carry with me. Finally, I took a cloth and gently wiped the frame of the family photograph. That sat on a shelf in the living room. With every swipe of the cloth, the warmth of time gone by seemed to linger on my fingertips. I placed the bare necessities in a small handbag, a few changes of clothes, the book I was in the middle of reading, and my husband's pen, a keepsake. I don't need to take everything, just a few small things to hold on to who I am. That's enough. As I whispered this to myself, I quietly zipped the bag closed. It was not about throwing away the past. It was a quiet ritual for beginning the future. The moment the taxi stopped and I saw the entrance to the facility, a strange feeling spread through my chest. Not anxiety, but relief. As I opened the door and stepped inside, a woman on the staff, dressed in a white uniform, called out to me with a smile. "Evelyn, welcome home." Just 2 words. But they were like a ray of morning sun breaking through the winter cold, and they gently warmed my heart. Someone was waiting for me. How long had it been since I had truly felt that? I thought back to the day I was discharged from the hospital. I had called a taxi by myself, stood at the front door by myself, and pushed the doorbell for 15 minutes. And when the door finally opened, all I received from my family was a cold stare. But here, in this place, there was someone who called me by my name, who looked me in the eye and said, "Welcome." How much a person can be saved just by knowing that someone is waiting for them. On that day, I truly felt that with all my heart. On the day of my orientation, I introduced myself to the new staff. "My name is Evelyn Miller. I've come here to close a chapter with my family and have chosen to live an independent life." My private room at the home was small, but it was clean and warm. The window looked out onto a green garden, and I was allowed to place a small potted plant on the windowsill. I felt a sense of relief knowing I could grow plants here, just as I had at my old house. I participated in the rehabilitation programs and recreational activities the staff had prepared, and slowly, I grew accustomed to my new daily life. At night, before I went to sleep, I would always write in my journal, "I have made the choice to live for myself again." Not as my family's convenient mother, but as a dignified human being who depends on no one's help. A few weeks later, the mediation board issued a formal ruling recognizing the invalidity of the contract and the reversion of ownership to Evelyn. Furthermore, I received word from the bank that my obligation to repay the loan would likely be canceled. When I received that news, I sat down on the sofa in the common room of the nursing home, a warm teacup in my hands, and let out a deep sigh of relief. I felt a profound joy, knowing that the freedom and security I couldn't have imagined just a short time ago were now firmly back in my grasp. With this, the amount of my settlement, the total including damages for pain and suffering and late fees, was close to being finalized, and yet, my family, living apart from me, was always somewhere in the back of my mind. From time to time, I would receive an apologetic email from my son, and even a shy message of thanks from my daughter-in-law. Raising my voice and taking action was the path to reclaiming my own dignity, and at the same time, the first step toward rebuilding my relationship with my family. But I still couldn't find the courage to see them in person, so I held back from replying. Still, I am certain of one thing. A few months later, a formal notice arrived for me. As a result of the lawsuit, the return of your assets and compensation for damages have been approved. The moment I opened the envelope, I felt something heavy that had been sitting in the bottom of my heart become just a little bit lighter. But strangely, I didn't feel a sense of joy. There was no smile, no tears. I just whispered quietly to myself, "I believe this money is not a punishment, but the price I paid to buy back my dignity." I never wanted to punish anyone. I just wanted a place where I could stand up again, not as a mother, but as a human being. And more than anything, I felt I was finally able to answer the words my husband once said to me. "If you end up living longer than me, Evelyn, I want you to live enough for the both of us. But don't you dare live your life by erasing yourself." Through this experience, I have learned, even if you are bound by blood, you never lose the right to demand respect from another person. And you can only break a lonely silence by raising your voice. My relationship with my family is still delicate, but now I have a place that is more certain than family. I have myself. Today, I live a quiet life here at this home, at my own pace. I sometimes enjoy rehabilitation exercises and my hobby of flower arranging. As I look back on my life, I do not resent my son or my daughter-in-law. That is precisely why their silence and their coldness were so painful, and why they revealed the truth to me. For 38 years, I worked as a nurse in a place where lives were in my hands. I supported my husband, raised my children, and dedicated myself to my family. After I was discharged from the hospital, the whiteness of the ceiling, I stared at in the dark felt cold, as if it were ignoring my very existence. And on the day I took that deed in my hand and raised my voice, for the first time, I was able to reclaim the person that is me. Dime, but I hope you understand that the closing of this chapter is not about resentment, but about growth. I'm not afraid of losing my mother. What's far more terrifying is treating my mother as if she doesn't exist. The moment my son said those words through his tears, I decided to forgive him. It's more than forgiveness, it's a choice to live together from now on. I left my former house and moved into this nursing home. Here, I was greeted by my name, and I once again knew the joy of being waited for. I have finally found a place where I belong, not as someone's child or someone's mother, but as myself. In my 72 years of life, I have learned blood ties alone do not make people cherish one another, but you must never sell your own dignities for a false love. I want to deliver this message, word for word, to all of you watching this. Even if it is someone you call family, if they are treating you with disregard, you have the right to speak up. We do not live our lives to be praised, to be told, good job, or thank you. We walk with pride, to shine as who we are. If you have ever returned to your family's home, only to find the door to their hearts was closed, please remember these words. Love cannot be bought with money, but dignity must never be sold, not even for a false love. With these words, I quietly take up my pen again today, arrange my flowers, and take a deep breath, embracing myself. I hope that you, too, will find the courage to reclaim your own voice and your own dignity. From Evelyn Miller, age 72, with all my heart. Have you ever come home and had no one say, "Welcome back"? If you dedicated your entire life to your children, and then one day, you realized you had become an outsider in your own home, please, write this in the comments. I don't need gratitude. I just want to be seen as part of the family. Please share this video. If you believe a mother should never be treated as a burden, follow our channel, and we will continue to bring you stories that give you a reason to stop and think of your mother.